So welcome, Jerry Benoit.
Well, I'm glad to be here today.
Jerry, you are a member of the Academy of Housing Communities with a long career in housing and communities. Why don't you contrast for us policy formation and regulation development then to policy development today?
Well, as a manager at HUD in development of policies, you got some of your direction from the political appointees and the direction that they wanted to go with the housing programs. The whole system started out with the Section 23 program. And I'm talking about the Section 23 leased housing program in the early 70s. We had the experimental housing program using that Section 23 program. There was a supply experiment and a demand experiment. The lessons learned from that were incorporated into a legislative proposal called the Section 23 Housing Assistance Program. Not enough to confuse people, right? That program, and I don't know why they decided to have, I don't remember why they decided to have a Section 23 HAP program. And I think that existed about 2 years, at which point it became the model and the design for the Section 8 new construction, substantial rehab, moderate rehab, existing housing, all of the various Section 8 programs. At one point, I had responsibility for all of them. Then we had a reorganization. The project-based programs stayed with the Office of Housing, and the existing housing program went to the Office of Public and Assisted Housing. The notion behind the Section 8 existing housing program was greater involvement of the private industry, owners of projects, and testing whether project-based versus tenant-based was desirable. To go back a little bit in history, part of the problem was that public housing tenants were trapped in the public housing projects and they couldn't get out of it. So conceptually, the purpose of the existing housing program was to provide families housing assistance, and by the same token, let them move with their housing assistance. In fact, I do a little flashback, the original Section 23 leased housing program. The existing housing program was called Finders Keepers. Families that were selected for the program went out, looked for a housing unit. There weren't any housing quality standards. And when they found a unit that they liked, including the unit they lived in, they would notify the housing authority of their housing choice. The family would sign a lease with the owner, and then the housing authority would pay some portion of the family's rent, which is a little different than today with the selection of families off the waiting list. They're searching for housing, coming back and reporting to the housing authority. It was a much quicker thing. As we started working with the certificate program, there were some things that were cumbersome. And HUD sent a legislative proposal to Congress to allow housing authorities the flexibility to permit families to pay more than 30% of their income for rent. Also, to get rid of utility allowances and something else, but I can't recall what the third one. The program came to be known as the Modified Certificate Program. Well, you know how people use acronyms or names. Just imagine that one. MCP. Some people absolutely abhorred that program call that. So he finally convinced Congress to make it a demonstration. So it became the voucher demonstration program. Well, our first chore was to convert all of the Section 23 housing assistance program, the new construction, rehab, state agencies, to the new Section 8 program. A lot of extra work as far as I was concerned. One of the things that people complained about, they were worried that HUD in the ivory tower would be divining and deciding all these policy issues with no input from anybody. I can say truthfully, and I hope that Narrow doesn't get mad with me, but the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials really didn't support the program in the beginning. Public housing agencies weren't too keen on it either. We had, in the early days, what I call an announcement year program. What we did is we set up a task force that met with housing authorities across the country. And our objective was to try to get 100,000 units under contract with housing authorities. Well, we fell a little bit short. We had about 9 months to do this and ended up with a little over 90,000 contract signings, which was phenomenal in my opinion. As time went on, the housing agencies and Narrow discovered that this existing housing program wasn't a bad deal. The housing authorities earned a generous administrative fee in those days, and they were able to use some excesses of their administrative fees to pay for some of the expenses with the public housing program. Well, this went on for years and years, and then I guess somebody in Congress finally got wise to it and started cutting back on the administrative fees. So housing authorities didn't have this, quote, slush fund to do as they pleased. The program grew pretty fast from 90,000 units to 1.5 million units. And as you pointed out today, they're up to 2 million. I personally had a problem with the existing housing program, and that was sort of the reason we went out with the housing voucher program. I was concerned that we were just encouraging or making it easier for families to be perpetually on a housing program. I had always thought that there had to be an end. Now, this is for families, not for the elderly. So we talked about term limits, but never got really far with that because no one wanted to deal with it. And again, it would have been an option for housing authorities to do term limits. So we moved along and came up with all of what I call boutique programs. The one of which I'm the most proud is the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which sort of went in a direction that I personally liked. That we would take families and tie them in with the local communities programs so that we had a package of goodies for them. They got the housing subsidy, then they had access to childcare, education, transportation, all the things they really needed. So the housing authority would set up these contracts with the locals. And we had somebody from the county executive's office, the mayor's office as part of that working group, which suddenly the housing authority started to buy in and the local government started to buy in. The notion of the family self-sufficiency program was that the family would sign with the housing authority a 5-year contract. And the housing authority would put into an escrow account for these families the difference between 30% of their income at the time they signed up and 30% of any earned income after that, giving them an escrow account for the day they graduated, which they could use to buy a house, for example, or a condo or whatever they wanted. And at that point would end their participation in the program. Although there was a little safety net that if the family fell back into economic problems, they would be able to come back into the program until they could get their act together. I mean, today, I don't know how that program's working with the coronavirus and everybody unemployed. But I'm trying to think. I think the last time I saw anything that more than 70,000 families had actually graduated from this program. Then came RAD, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. And that program was designed to make vouchers project-based. Well, I had a major problem with that because that was bringing us right back to all the problems with public housing. So after a lot of discussion, deliberation, and argument on my side, we came up with a scheme whereby the housing authority could pledge vouchers to a project for up to 15 years, and individual families had to agree to stay in a project for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, the family was allowed to move out, which was not true in the public housing program. And what they did is they had to request a voucher from the housing authority to move. Well, if the housing authority didn't have any, they had to wait. Then, when the housing authority had one, they would give it to the family and the family could move. Well, what happened to the empty unit? Well, the empty unit was pledged to the housing authority for 15 years. So the housing authority would refer families that were eligible for that particular project, and they would get, if they liked it, they would get to move in there instead of having a free choice voucher, with the understanding that at the end of 2 years, they'd have the same ability as the previous family to move, provided that the housing authority had a certificate to give them. In the middle of all of this, we had to come up with standards for making sure that the families were renting that didn't go into these projects decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So the answer to that was housing quality standards. And that was a real nightmare. And why I say it was a nightmare, we hired a contractor to develop housing standards that would fit everybody. Appalachia, rural housing, urban centers. So you just couldn't have a housing standard that was out of the reach of many of the families that were participating in this program. So after much grief and much discussion with the industry, as you recall, Nan, you were one of the major trainers in this area, we finally got something that seemed to work. A lot of people don't realize that at the time we were doing this, some housing didn't even have running water or central heating or stuff like that. You know, it was space heaters. Some didn't even have bathrooms. So all of this stuff made it difficult. Fortunately, our research company was able to go in and look at the existence of minimal features such as bathrooms and heating. And so he finally came up with these housing quality standards, which became the base for all housing units. Well, needless to say, if any units developed under the RAD program didn't have this problem, so we didn't really need an inspection requirement, but we still do. But it's done on a percentage of the size of the project.
Let's talk for a minute about family self-sufficiency. Back when the program first started, we used the lower income limits, and then eventually that went down to the very low income limits. And then we had the requirement for new admissions of 75% of the families had to be extremely low income. And I think that did not help the up and out perspective of family self-sufficiency that you and I had talked about a long time in the very beginning, that we wanted people to get off the program and become sufficient. But as they lowered the income limit, it made it more and more difficult to do. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was sort of one of my gripes when they came up with the legislation dealing with eligibility for the program. The powers to be, I don't think, understood the programs. I had argued that the use of income limits be interpreted to be across both the public housing and Section 8 programs. Public housing had more at a very low income. And the way they set it up, both programs had a cap on very low income and, I don't know, what's the other one, lower income? You know this better than me. And that really made the Section 8 program or the voucher program very difficult to administer because the public housing was still staying at 50% of median income or 30%. There weren't very many families that were being admitted into public housing that had incomes above that. We'd have loved to have those families in the Section 8 program because it would have facilitated our up and out. But unfortunately, as a matter of law, and the people that negotiated that, I don't think really understood the implications of it.
Let's talk a little bit about rent reasonableness too, because we didn't always have that. I don't remember when that came about, but I'm sure you remember why.
That was a problematic policy. Well, understandably, we needed the rent reasonableness to make sure that families weren't getting ripped off, so to speak, or being charged more than they would have been had they been market rate families. One of the things that we discovered in some of our research, that rent reasonableness didn't really make a difference in the units selected by families. And again, remember now, in the early days, under the original certificate program, you needed rent reasonableness. Under the voucher program, unfortunately, you didn't need that, but housing authorities continued to do that. Because under the voucher program, remember that the subsidy was fixed as a flat amount based on 30% of a family's income and the fair market rents. And the families were allowed to lease anything they wanted if they understood that anything over the fixed subsidy they were getting from the housing authority, they would have to pay, which negated the real need for a rent reasonableness test, leaving it up to the families to decide whether the rent was a good or bad one. This also mitigated the need for exception rents, the 10% exceptions and the 20% exceptions. But in some cases, they were necessary, especially in tight housing markets and the like, to figure the family subsidy on the basis of the fair market rent, which covered a big geographical areas, and then have to hit them with these more expensive rents in the suburban areas that we were trying to get them to move to. Another problem that existed with all of this is that under the voucher program, housing authorities were not required to adjust the subsidy every year. But They did. Every time the fair market rents were published, they'd adjust the subsidy. Originally, the voucher program only required it once in a 5-year period. Again, part of that was to encourage families to work more, earn more money, and pay more toward rent. So the housing authorities were sort of making the voucher program a certificate program because of their feelings about not harming families, but was just the opposite of what we were trying to do at HUD, is to try to encourage families to go out and work and be self-sufficient and be able to pay their own way.
I think some of that was a protection kind of philosophy. I don't know, maybe just housing authorities had, between the rent reasonableness and the affordability limit on the new lease up. Those are two things that limited the amount of rent that the family could pay, but they could also be looked at as protections of the family.
Oh, I fully understand that. And of course, today that would be very important with the pandemic, because housing, the families we work with, or the housing authorities work with, are on the bottom of the income scale and wouldn't be able to deal with their rent. So I'm sure, I know we have at the Housing Commission had to do a lot of interim re-exams because families were losing their jobs. I mean, our resident commissioner, or our program commissioner, was a school bus driver and also worked a couple other little jobs on the side. So she was doing pretty good until the schools closed. And then they let her go, said they didn't have any work for her. Now, some communities had owned the school buses, so they were able to take those bus drivers and use them inside their school doing childcare or stuff like that, which was really nice, but we didn't have that. We didn't own the buses.
Why do you think that the voucher program rose to the distinction of being the largest subsidized housing program?
Well, you know, it's up over 2 million households today. I would say about 70%, maybe a little bit more, are elderly and disabled households. So there aren't a lot of families in the program. It's sort of the new housing of last resort that the public housing program used to play. So the families are actually moving out of giving up their subsidies when the subsidy becomes very small. We have a lot of families that have been working in the family self-sufficiency program that have worked themselves into a situation where their out-of-pocket cost was like $25 a month. Well, they decide, I'm not going through all this hassle for $25 a month. I'm just going to leave. I can make it. I know I can. So, you know, that was one of the reasons people leave. Of course, people move away or get married or whatever, which are also other contributing factors.
I think maybe politically, there's also a good feeling about a subsidy program that is not tied directly to a building, you know, that has the ability maybe for Congress to cut it a little more easily that way because there's no building attached. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think housing agencies, communities fear that this is going to be public housing. Although it comes under a different name, rental assistance, it's still project-based, and is that project where all those people live. And that is not, in my opinion, anything that's desirable. I think part of the image problem is, you know, in a project-based, it's not limited to 50% of median income. Depends on how it was financed. If it was with some tax credits, it could be, some of the units could be up to 80% of median income, which gives you a kind of an income mix. But to the extent that these families are going to work and their subsidies are going down, the local communities are getting to love this program. our county executive really thinks it's a great program, especially when you combine it with the family unification program. I work very closely with the Child Welfare Agency and that other entity on which I'm the board to see if somehow or other we couldn't tie the family self-sufficiency program with the Child Welfare Agency's expenses for placing families in foster care, because the cost of putting somebody in foster care, especially if there are two children, far exceed the subsidy. So we convinced them, because they have some other connections in terms of childcare and transportation, education, SNAP, welfare payments. So we were able to put together a pretty good partnership between HUD and the Child Welfare Agency to bring some of these families together. They save money. We help these families reunite as a family unit rather than having the kids spread out to foster care, assuming the families were capable of handling it. So that was a big advance, in my view, of achieving some of the goals that we had established to try to get families more self-sufficient and establish them as a family unit instead of separated, mothers separated from their kids. I might add as a little side note, at the time that I was working on this self-sufficiency program, it was developed at a time when I was at the Federal Executive Institute, and I met and got pretty friendly with the federal executive, a county federal executive, who had been a former congressman, and we were talking about the plight of single mothers and kids, and he wanted to get some kind of program together to help them. So we started, he used his political connections on the Senate and got them to approve a demonstration program. It started out as Project Independence. It was a very small program, a little bit of vouchers or certificates at the time, and a project-based 236 project. And from there it grew, Jack Kemp called it Operation Bootstrap. And all during this time, I personally was a single parent. And I couldn't help but feel bad for these families trying to struggle to keep their family together, the kids, housing, and all the things that go. Fortunately, I had a nice paying job, but I certainly was sympathetic to people that didn't have or couldn't have those good jobs. So that was sort of a little background on why I pushed so hard to get this program implemented and expanded.
If I remember right, you had 6 children as a single parent.
I still do, man.
You still do.
I guess they do all right because all my grandchildren of age are going to college, so I guess they're doing well.
Do you consider the voucher program or the certificate program your biggest legacy in your life with your experience at HUD, or do you have something else?
Well, no, I think that the voucher program would be my biggest legacy in all of the boutique programs, family self-sufficiency and hope for elderly independence and the regional mobility program. All of those things are nice. But my second love was the family self-sufficiency program. Out of all the things I did at HUD, although the voucher program has my imprimatur on it, the family self-sufficiency is the thing that I like the best.
What thoughts can you share with us on your views of HUD and various secretaries, presidents, or congressional committees that you've worked with?
Being a career person, albeit in a high management position, interaction with secretaries was pretty good. I think most of the secretaries, there are a few exceptions, felt, they delegated the jobs to the people down below. And I can remember one instant, where we were in a meeting with the secretary and he was jumping all over the budget director because she couldn't answer some questions. He turned around to me and said, "Hey, Jerry," he answers what I told him. And he looks at the budget director. He said, "Don't you talk to your program people?"
So, Jerry, do you have any stories of any of the secretaries that you worked with?
Yeah, I have one in particular. As a matter of fact, that really tied me into the HUD Secretary Hills. HUD had a requirement that all of the managers had to function as HUD secretary for a weekend. And what the job was is we would take all the calls to the secretary or being called to the secretary and see what the problem was. And we would then call the appropriate assistant secretary to handle the problem. Well, when I was doing it one day or one weekend, I happened to be going out to get myself a snack or something at the snack bar. And just as I opened the door, it was Carla Hills' first day. And I walked right into her. And you should have seen the lady's face. She said, "What are you doing in my office?" I said, "Oh, I'm your secretary for the day." So we got to chatting about this process. Well, afterwards, she used to eat lunch in the HUD cafeteria every day. And if she'd see me, she'd come up and talk to me. And then when I'd be at meetings with her, and I can remember one particular instance where an assistant secretary was feeding her a line about something he wanted to do that made absolutely no sense. And she turned around and looked at the deputy and said, "Do you agree with this?" And he says, "Of course." And then she turns around. I happened to be sitting behind her. She turned around and said, "Jerry, do you have to live with these guys?"
That's pretty good.
That's the kind of person she was. And from that day forward, every time she saw me, she always said, "Hi, Jerry," by name, you know. Well, you want to hear one more? When Alfonso Jackson came to HUD as the deputy secretary, my assistant secretary called all of his managers in to meet the deputy secretary, and they're going around the table, and everybody say, "Oh, I'm Ray Hamilton. I'm the director of public housing," and give a little bit of background of himself. He gets to me and he says, "I'm Jerry Benoit." He says, "You don't have to tell me who you are. Everybody knows you." I think my assistant secretary died.
Well, you were well known throughout the building. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I kind of, that's a part I miss. And I look at, the conferences and the speakers at conferences like Narrow and the leadership at Narrow. Hardly any executive directors that I can remember were there when I was there. So I guess they're all gone.
It gets to be a long time ago.
Right. Well, I retired in 2006, so it was 14 years ago.
And time flies, doesn't it?
Right.
What do you think is the biggest challenge in the housing and community arena that we're facing today?
I think the thing that I was most successful in was navigating the political interface with the career people. And if they suggested something that was way off the mark, I say, "Listen, we've been there, done that, and it doesn't work." And then I had another thing with the political types. If they had some kind of idea, my first thing would be, "We've been there, done that, and it doesn't work." And they said, "Well, I still want it to work." I said, "Well, I'll do it, but you really want to reconsider. I'll be more than happy to brief you on the details." And then if they said, "I want to do it," I shut my mouth and did it, because 2 times was enough. 1 time elaborate, and 1 time, "Okay, boss." He had his marching orders. I said, "Okay, I'm not going to embarrass you. I'll do it." eventually they got to understand what I was talking about. And then they'd back off with an acute way, you know. It's like, we didn't really mean that. I think you misunderstood. Yeah, right, I misunderstood. Sound familiar today, right?
So how do you feel about that with the current environment? What do you think is some of the biggest challenge that housing authorities are facing today?
Well, our housing authority is converting everything to RAD, which drives me nuts. But as being on the board, I can only give my opinions, and if the rest of the board disagrees, I get the lonely. But the salvation is that it's not a perpetual stuck in a project. We're going to convert. We've converted our two biggest family projects, and they're absolutely gorgeous. We're in the process of doing our first two elderly projects. We did two projects under the demo dispo program, and those two projects are beautiful. As a matter of fact, when we had the groundbreaking for one, I was talking to the county executive, and she said to me, "Hey, Jerry, do you think I could move into one of these apartments?" I said, "I don't think you're going to make it. Your income's too high."
What do you think is the future of affordable housing?
Well, certainly the demand is going to be there forever. And I don't see, since I left HUD, the size of the certificate and voucher programs grew from 1.5 million, and I think today it's just a shade over 2 million households participating in the program. You know, that's 500,000 people in 15 years. So the growth, and then all the growth has been in special programs. I don't see Congress approving a lot of money to increase these programs. I mean, there was a point 2 or 3 years where we got no new appropriations, or the appropriations were very targeted to, like the bailout of 236 projects and other subsidized housing projects. And they were called tenant protection vouchers. Well, that was one of the beauties of my notion of trying to get families to move out of the projects, so that because of turnover, be it for family self-sufficiency or other reasons, units become available so that we can put them on our waiting list. And some housing authorities have waiting lists that people are going to be on there after till they die. There are some choices now. We have been dealing with private developers who have asked us to be partners to develop some projects. We have 3 in development right now. There's no commitment of vouchers, and we're just signing off as a sponsor of the project and getting some percentage of ownership at the end of 15 years. Some projects we manage for the owners, some we don't. Those that we don't, I suspect the owners are going to want us to manage them at some point. So that has been increasing the amount of housing in our county for low-income families. So that's been good, because it's a substitution for trying to get HUD, or for HUD getting appropriations from Congress to fund additional units.
I know you have 6 children and you have quite a few grandchildren.
14.
14, okay.
I had my first great-grandchild.
Woo! If there's a life lesson to pass along to younger people, what would it be?
I think they have to understand, and this is not an easy thing to do, but there are lots of opportunities for young kids today, especially kids in welfare families, is to just get them out of this dependence on federal aid, because it's going to end someday, or it's going to be a lot shallower than it is today. And, you know, as the man says, the most important thing you can have is a good education. And then even if you're working at, you know, minimum wage jobs. It's better than nothing. And eventually you move up. My two daughters, granted, they graduated from college, came out of college and got nice jobs. My son went to law school. He's doing all right. So a lot of it is keeping active and keeping out of trouble and going to school and getting your education. And of course, for some of those who want to, a government service isn't all bad deal, as I am proof.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on board with us. Is there anything else that you would like to say to the listeners?
I feel fulfilled in what I did, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Although I might finish with a few things that are not really related. As you mentioned, I spent 42 years working at HUD, developing programs, policies, and procedures. And then I went to work for you in your consulting business and learned real quick, boy, some of these policies were way off the mark and they weren't appreciated. So that I was able to work with some of these housing authorities to try to tell them that they're interpreting some of the things wrong and that there are ways forward. It really came to roost when I was appointed to the Housing Authority or the Housing Commission, and I've been there for a little over 10 years to see how people react and how they plan and how they develop. And fortunately, I was able to work closely with them, working on their goals and objectives and how they were going to succeed getting there. We've done some reorganizations that I think work really well, and some simplification of processing. I never realized how paper intensive these programs are. Oh my goodness, the paper that flows. And I feel housing authorities have my sympathy. I saw it in some of the housing agencies that I worked with for you, and I see it with my own housing agency. I don't know how you get rid of some of that stuff. I mean, just the income verification, certification, eligibility, all of the paperwork that goes in with that. It's got to be an easier way. You know what I find interesting? When I left HUD in 2006, I had drafted a new rule, total rule for the voucher program, which gave maximum flexibility to the housing authority to deal with certain things. And I went around the country visiting with housing authorities in all 50 states, talking to them about where I thought this should go, getting their ideas on it. And after that, sat down with my staff, and some of them would say, oh, we can't do this. I said, yes, we're going to do it. This is what I want you to write, and we'll see if we can get it through the system. Well, never left my desk. We had it all packaged and ready to go, and the lawyers signed off on it, and the political types didn't want any part of it. That's when I left.
Well, I wish you were still there trying to cut that paper. Now people are going digital and it's not quite as bad. If we can get DocuSign and some things like that in place, but it is hard because there is a lot of paper involved.
Well, I well know when we were trying to automate, when Housing Authority that you were a contract administrator for, sitting and trying to do flow charts of where the paper moves, how many people touch it, inspections coordinated with re-exams and the like. It was a challenge. And I think it's something that, unless you're a real small housing authority, which is the ones that don't need it, big housing authorities, I can't imagine somebody like New York trying to do this with 100,000 families. Can you imagine a paper?
Yep, it's pretty wild. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, but I also appreciate all the years that you have spent working on these programs. That voucher program would not be the same program today at all if you had not championed it like you did from the very, very beginning. You started with practically nothing but a piece of legislation and turned it into a program that is so viable today and is still going today. And I really appreciate everything that you have done to make it like it is.
Well, you know, by the same token, and you too, I oftentimes provided you with some information and interpreted some regulations for you, knowing that you were doing all this training to housing authorities. So at least you were my voice, so to speak, in trying to get housing agencies to understand what these regulations really said. And I'm sure without you, and you're the only one in the world that was doing this at the time, I'm sure there's others, but you were the primary one, and I was not bashful to give you stuff and say, man, you got to get this point across, you know?
Well, it was a good working relationship. We were able to make the program as good as we could possibly make it by working together. I remember we used to do the Jerry and Nan shows across the country, and those were some of the most fun times we ever had.
You mean when we were doing the training? Wait, one last little cute joke. When we were doing the training on HQS, I had to do an inspection of the unit and come back with fail items. And your people had determined this unit failed because the windows didn't open. And I says, well, did anybody bother to unlock it to see if it opened?
Sometimes it's the simplest little things that catch you.
Right.
Well, thanks again. And we hope that you are very successful in your continuing efforts in the housing field and in being a grandpa and great grandpa.
Well, I thank you very much. And your grandma too. So what do you have, 3?
No, we have 4 and a couple more from Jim's, 3 more from Jim's. So we can say we're up to 7, you know.
Oh, that's good. You get catching up with me.
I never will catch up with you, I don't think. Thank you again.
Okay, thanks, Ann. Nice seeing you.
If you enjoyed this video, please join Kent and me, and please subscribe free to this channel. Share it with your friends and click on the thumbs up icon to like us.